Hello down there. You seem a long way away. I'll let you get settled with water, etc. Any notes that you require? Order, and could I welcome our first guest to the special session of the Scottish Affairs Committee here from the wonderful surroundings of Edinburgh University, to whom we're very grateful once again for hosting this committee. We're here today as part of our My Scottish Affairs inquiry, where we're interested to hear the views of Civic Scotland about what this committee should be looking at in the course of this Parliament. And we're also hoping to open it up to the public to hear their representations. And we've got an online campaign. If anybody's watching this at home, please give us your submissions about the sort of issues that we should be looking at. And just to let our guests know that this is going out live on our website and will be recorded. But can I welcome you all this morning? Perhaps just by way of kicking things off, we could go from left to right. You can just tell us who you are, and you know why you're here. It's making a pitch for what this committee should be looking at, and perhaps you could share with us your views about issues that concern you, interest you, and you think that we could purposefully take up as a committee. We'll start with you, Alistair, please.
Oh, right, I'm Alistair Sim. I'm the Director of University Scotland, which is the representative organisation for the leaders of all Scottish higher education institutions. Do you want me to go on?
Please, yes.
Yeah, great. Well, we've put a written submission in, and first of all, I'd just like to say thank you to the Scottish Affairs Committee for inviting us, and also for the value of the issues that you've been able to highlight over the past years, particularly, for instance, on...
Can I just stop just for a... Can everybody hear Alistair all right at the back? We're okay, yes? Right. We're struggling a little bit here.
Do I need to do something with this? How's that?
No, you're okay. I think we're all right if everybody else is... Right, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, Alistair, you're in full flow there.
Yeah, so I think particularly your reports on demography and on post-study work have been really important in identifying issues that need government and parliamentary attention. Things that we think will be interesting over the next session for the committee to look into. First of all, industrial strategy. I think there's a huge opportunity there for Scotland. There's big money there which can really catalyse sustainable economic growth in Scotland if it's used properly. But I think we need scrutiny of whether the way that the industrial strategy is being developed and the way that challenge funds are being set up is one that is transparent and open, that Scottish interests can really compete for, and that there is some sort of joint governance of all this. I think the Scottish Government and the UK Government are both big economic actors in Scotland, and I think the Scottish Government need to be involved in setting the rules of the game and taking a view on what is going to produce economic benefit for Scotland from the various things that the industrial strategy could promote. Quite closely related to that, I think the committee should keep an oversight of how UK research and innovation is working. That will be one of the major agencies of promoting innovation-led economic growth. It's an area where, as the Higher Education and Research Bill was going through, we had some concerns, for instance, that placing Research England into a UK-wide organisation would lead the funders in UKRI to think first of all about English institutions when they were making decisions, and we stressed the need for there to be, again, a bit of shared governance in this, because the Scottish Government is a really major funder of research in Scotland alongside the research councils and Innovate UK, and we think there needs to be proper co-ownership of that, proper consultation, and I think a memorandum of understanding with the Scottish Government. We think that it would be valuable for the committee to keep an eye on how Brexit is working for Scotland, and from our point of view, a Brexit that really works for maintaining our openness to flows of talent and our connectedness to research communities across Scotland. And related to that, obviously, continuing its interest in having a wider immigration system that enables us to be open to the talent that our economy needs from wherever it comes from. And finally, I think it would be valuable if the committee took a view on how the emerging work both of UK government and of Scottish government to really promote Scotland overseas was working. I think this is a work in progress, but it's one worth seeing as it develops, whether it's synergistic between, for instance, the Great campaign promoting the UK overseas and the work that Scottish Government is doing, which includes universities, to promote Scotland as a really welcoming and open destination.
Grateful. Thank you very much, Alistair. Helen, lovely to see you again. Please, what do you think we should be looking at?
I think, just by way of introduction, I'm Helen Martin, I'm an Assistant General Secretary from the STUC. I think it comes as no surprise really that one of the biggest priorities for the STUC over the next period is about the changing nature of the labour market and the shape and sustainability of work. I think we're very concerned about the rise in low quality employment, the sort of change to the economy and the rise of the gig economy and what that does to workers and the precarious nature of work. We're concerned about levels of pay in the economy, the fact that wages are low and stagnating, and we are interested in things that government might usefully be able to do in order to improve the quality of work, improve the quality of jobs associated with that work, and also raise the levels of pay available to workers within the economy. And we think that these are very serious issues that do need to be looked at in some detail in order to develop the sorts of strategies that we might need to intervene effectively in the economy. And related to that, I think it's difficult to ignore the issue of Brexit. Brexit is going to have a very big effect on the Scottish economy and the UK economy. I think it's clear that it's coming at a time when we are not in a particularly good economic position. We've had a decade now of austerity policies, and the basis upon which Brexit is coming is quite challenging for businesses. And I would agree with what Alistair said. I think there is a role for the Scottish Affairs Committee to consider what Scotland can usefully do to prepare ourselves for Brexit, and the sorts of policies that we might need around immigration, around support for business, around an effective industrial strategy to really pave the way and prepare for that process, which I think is going to be quite challenging for businesses and workers alike. And finally, I think it would be useful to consider the ongoing effect that austerity is having on the economy, and the ongoing effect that policies like the public sector pay cap is continuing to have on the economy, and whether or not these are the right interventions for the economy when it's moving into this new phase. I think those things are three very weighty issues that could potentially be looked at this committee and be very valuable.
Great, thank you. Just before we bring you in, Colin, just to let you know that the committee agreed at its last meeting it will continue with their sustainable employment inquiry, and we're looking to hold another couple of sessions, evidence sessions, and conclude that report, and hopefully it will be available before the end of the year. I know that STUC helped us out immensely with that report, which we're very grateful. Colin, nice to see you again too. How are you doing?
Thank you very much. I'm well, thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation. Just by way of introduction, for those who have not met before, and for the record, I'm Colin Boland. I'm Head of Devolved Nations for FSB, the Federation of Small Businesses. And one of the things that we thought might be quite interesting for the committee to look at is something that we've been sort of debating and discussing and chewing over for a couple of years now, and that's around about the theme of economic resilience and community resilience. For the last sort of 40 years since the decline of heavy industry, there's been too many communities in Scotland feel that they've been tossed on these international waves of global forces that they can't control, and we still have too many places that have too many of their eggs in too few baskets. So that means that they are vulnerable to those sorts of global pressures, vulnerable to changes in industry, vulnerable to other sort of wider national economic pressures. They can't take advantage of the economy when it's on the up. The idea that the rising tide lifts all boats has been, I don't think the evidence really supports that. And there are areas where you would say there isn't really a private sector economy worthy of the name, really. So The complex and interlinked issues behind that and what we can do to address it is the sort of thing that we might have ideas about, might have things that we want to explore, but there's a lot of meat in there that we feel that a committee inquiry would be sufficiently resourced to investigate. And also, there are some quite interesting competing ideas about what we should do about this, because some people might argue, well, what you really need is a big expanse in private sector employment. You need much more entrepreneurial activity, you need much more self-employment. Others might argue what you actually need is more state intervention, or perhaps something more akin to protectionism. These things are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but in terms of what we do about it, there probably are some interesting competing ideas out there, and what better place to debate that than at a parliamentary committee.
Great. Well, I'm grateful to all of you for very concise opening statements, which I think are all recorded and taken down, but I know we've got a couple of other questions from committee members. So first of all, we've got John Lamont.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning. I want to pursue a little bit more about the state of the Scottish economy. You'll know that Scotland recently avoided going into recession with the last round of GDP figures showing economic growth around 0.1%. Over the last year, Scotland's growth has been around 0.5% compared to 1.5% for the whole of the UK. Now, I just wondered if you could give us your views as to why there is this difference between how the Scottish economy is doing relative to the rest of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, we don't need to hear from everybody, but maybe hear from Helen and Colin on that one. I can see Helen.
I just wasn't sure if you were looking specifically at me or
collectively.
I think this is an issue that we've obviously been very concerned about ourselves, and we've been looking quite intensely at the economic figures around this. And I think one of the things that we have noted around the difference between Scotland and the UK economy is the effect of the oil and gas supply chain really within the figures. So we have seen the oil and gas sector in some trouble over the last few years. Growth rates have been very, very low, and that has had a knock-on effect on the oil and gas supply chain, which is featured within the Scottish economic data. There was, you'll recall, about 2 quarters ago, quite a big jump in growth in the Scottish economy relative to the UK economy, and that was driven primarily through production and through the oil and gas supply chain. So you can see the effect that specific sector is having on the wider outcome of Scotland. I think as well there has been a real growth in self-employment in Scotland, much greater than and faster than in other parts of the UK, although it should be noted that self-employment in Scotland is still relatively low compared to other parts of the UK. But I think it is notable that in line with trends in other places, self-employment is primarily low-paid self-employment, and I think that raises some concerns about how our economy is starting to recover from the crash and the sorts of work that's now available within the economy. So some of that will be about people becoming sort of consultants in kind of marginal businesses that are quite difficult to sustain, and some of it is about the gig economy and different ways of working and that kind of low-paid feature of self-employment that we are now seeing much more prevalently. I think it also speaks to some of the wider difficulties in the structure of the labour market and the fact that people don't have a lot of money in their pockets. So a lot of what is driving the growth in the UK is actually consumption. So here in Scotland that is also the case, but I think we should remember that with wages falling and with debt levels rising, that is fairly unsustainable in the longer term.
Thank you for that. In your opening remarks, you made reference to the pay cap affecting the economy in Scotland. Clearly, the pay cap applies in the rest of the UK in the same way as it applies in Scotland. Could you just sort of drill down a bit more and explain why the pay cap in Scotland is affecting the economy more so than the rest of the United Kingdom?
Well, I don't think I made that point, but what I would say is that the pay cap across the UK is having an impact on our economy, because when one of the main drivers of your economy is consumption, people not having money in their pockets does affect whether or not your economy is going to grow. So there are other parts of the economy where pay is low as well, but it is quite clear that the public sector has a direct influence on public sector pay. So the government could decide tomorrow to change the pay cap, and that would be a contribution to economic stimulus. And I think it is notable that a 1% pay cap is now significantly below the rate of inflation. So I think when we've got a difficult economic climate, this is something that is and should be considered as a way of stimulating the economy and improving economic measures across the board.
Does any of our other guests? I saw you were itching to get analysis with that one, yeah?
Yeah, I just really thinking about economic growth from our perspective. I think one of the perennial problems and puzzles in Scotland is that we've got a really good level of investment in higher education, research and development, but we're typically not doing as well in terms of business investment in research and development. The same is true of the UK as a whole, but I think more acutely in Scotland. And this troubles me because it worries. I think my sense is that if Scotland is going to be really prosperous, it's got to be in a sort of race to the top about skills and innovation and adding value in ways that other countries can't do. Now, I think as universities, we're proud to be helping about over 18,000 businesses a year with innovation and consultancy and producing graduates with an increasingly entrepreneurial mindset. But I think there's things that government in its various forms needs to think about, particularly, for instance, how do we support ideas when you've got to the point where you've got a really good idea, for instance, it's come from a business or a university, but it's not yet commercialisable. Should we be putting more support into bridging that gap between the great idea and its turning into a really commercialisable proposition? Should we be gearing government support at a wider range of businesses? Now, one of my hopes from the Scottish Government's Enterprise and Skills Review is that instead of Scottish Enterprise concentrating on a reasonably small number of portfolio managed companies, that it spreads its efforts much wider in an SME economy, so that we are creating this virtuous cycle of having more innovative SMEs demanding more innovation support from universities, so that we are in this virtuous catalytic cycle between business and universities to create prosperity.
Okay, right, thank you. We've only really got half an hour for this session, so we're trying to rush through as much as possible, so we don't need a response from all of you, but I know Colin will definitely want to come in on this. So
yeah, just I'll be brief as I possibly can, because I think the question that you raised is absolutely the right one about why is this the differential performance between the two. It's a really interesting question, and we look back at, for example, our Small Business Confidence Index figures, and Scotland has tracked below the UK average every quarter with the exception of one for something like the last 5 years. So we can ascribe some of that to short-term issues and medium-term issues like the drop in the oil and gas price, or the disproportionate impact that changes to employment or rising cost pressures will have for an economy like ours, which is very reliant on tourism and the service industry, particularly sort of the northern half of the country, being particularly reliant on tourism and hospitality. But that doesn't explain why this has been going on for this length of 5 years. I think some of that comes back to the point that I made in my opening remarks about the shape of our local economies and how they are working and not working. There's something going on there that we don't fully understand yet, and I think it definitely merits further exploration.
Beautiful, thank you. Okay, John. Danielle.
Good morning. While unemployment has remained at record lows in Scotland, Hill and SUC have raised concerns that the unemployment isn't being matched by decent wages for workers, and you mentioned in your opening statement about quality of work as well. Why do you think that low unemployment isn't leading to higher wages, and what do you think the risks of that are?
I think that's a very interesting question, because, you know, traditionally and classically, low unemployment is supposed to drive wages. I mean, I think it is considered a puzzle from the economics perspective that we do have historically low levels of unemployment, like really quite significantly low, and yet we are still seeing wages falling. And I think it's clear to say that raises some very significant questions about the shape of our economy and the nature of work. From the trade union point of view, we are not that puzzled, actually. I think this speaks to quite long-standing issues within our economy. First is the level of union organisation, which is just simply too low. There are far too many workers in the economy who don't have a trade union bargaining for them, and are not covered by collective bargaining, and I think that does push down on wages. Secondly, I'd say there's a lack of confidence around for workers in the economy, so workers are prioritising maintaining their job rather than necessarily going out and changing job, and it's actually that change that often can drive up wages and can drive up competition for work. There's equally some things that are artificially put into the economy, like the public sector pay cap that restrains wages by policy. There's then also the fact that you've got a real rise in precarious work. So you've got quite a lot of workers who are now on 0 hours contracts. They're in forms of bogus self-employment. They're perhaps in other forms of self-employment that aren't bogus but are very precarious and are therefore very low paid. And I think that means that people struggle to bargain for higher wages because all their bargaining power is really going into bargaining for work, bargaining for the hours in the morning and making sure that they are the ones who are given that, because that is the nature of precarious work. So I think it's not an easy picture in many ways because there's a few different issues happening at once within the economy. But the overall effect is that wages are now but real wages are falling because wage rises are below the rate of inflation, and obviously the rate of inflation is relatively high because of the low pound, so that contributes as well. But it is a picture that is difficult to maintain within the long term because we cannot have living standards continuing to fall each year.
Okay, thank you for that. David Dogood.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, panel. Alistair, I think specifically to you, just to save some time, you mentioned the industrial strategy. The UK industrial strategy. What specific opportunity do you think that presents for Scotland?
I think it could be very, very real. I think by 2020 we're seeing another £2 billion a year of Scottish government, of UK government investment going into joint ventures between industry and universities, particularly to create innovation-led economic growth. And I think there are different levels of opportunity there. I think there are various challenge funds, for instance, on robotics in hostile environments, on battery technology, for instance, where I think we've got research strengths. We want to be in there competing in joint ventures with university and industry to actually win funds from the government. We need to make sure that the rules of the game are transparent. I think beyond that, there may be opportunities for some really big investments along the lines of the Crick Institute in London or the Royce Institute and the Graphene Institute in Manchester. And I think what we are concerned to see is that there are really transparent rules of competition about who can go in there and say, look, actually, we could get a big bit of research council infrastructure in Scotland. We've got a tiny proportion of that at the moment, or we could get a big bit of Innovate UK investment in Scotland. Again, we don't have much of that relatively at the moment because we've got great ideas. I think we have a sense that some of the investments we've made up to now have gone to people who've had great ideas, pitched them directly to Treasury, so the sharpest elbows have won. And I think if there were fairer and more transparent rules of competition and joint assessment between UK government and Scottish government about their economic benefit, we would see a playing field in which Scotland would have a better chance of coming forward with great ideas that get funded to promote economic growth.
I mean, just to say, I think, like looking at the industrial strategies come up quite a lot in terms of the responses we've had to appeals for help with designing our programme for the next few years. And we know that the government's currently consulting on this, and there's very few details about how these joint ministerial forums will be set up. And I think the committee, hearing what we've heard so far, would be interested in seeing how this could work out. So anything that either of you could do to help us shape up some sort of terms of reference or ways we could look at this, it would be really, really helpful. Does anybody else want to come in an industrial strategy at all, or can we move on? No? Okay. Tommy Shepherd.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. I'd like to turn to the effect of immigration policy on the economy. The UK government's current position is that UK-wide immigration policy is capable of delivering for all parts of the UK and is sensitive to regional economic variations. I wonder if you would agree with that in the current situation. And I wonder also if and when the UK leaves the European Union, what case you think could be made for differential immigration policy in different parts of the UK, particularly Scotland.
I'm happy to answer that first, if you like. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note at the outset that not just are there large variations within the UK, there are large variations within Scotland as well. And I think Scotland-wide, about 26% of our members have at least one non-UK EU member of staff on the team. But when you go sort of into the Highlands, that rises to 40%. It's over 40% in certain sectors, such as tourism and hospitality. So there's no doubt that we need some sort of system that is responsive to local labour market needs. Now, the mechanics of how one does that without having lots of different competing tiny little local systems, while still making sure that those particular local or sectoral requirements are met, is going to be a really interesting one. And I think we could possibly, a place to start might be looking at other systems around the world. There are some in, I think, Sweden, bits of Scandinavia, where if you have a permit to work, then you can come and work. So you're not tied to a particular employer. It takes the burden away from the employer. So perhaps something like that might be able to operate. But I mean, until we see the terms of the deal and what we're doing and what the framework's going to be, it's really sort of difficult to propose a hard and fast model at the moment, I think.
I mean, I think there's UK levels and devolved levels here. I mean, I think at the UK level, overall, you know, the university sector, Scottish, English, whatever, needs to be as open as possible to the migration of talent. I mean, you know, the free flow of people and ideas across boundaries is just lifeblood for universities. But I also think, you know, we should look creatively at the opportunities for doing things a bit differently in Scotland. I mean, this is one of the things we've talked about previously in the context of post-study work. We do have different demographics. We do have businesses that are, you know, crying out to be able to use these talents that are coming across borders for a period after graduation. We do have examples like in Canada, the provincial nominee scheme, where devolved governments can do something supplementary to what federal governments can do to bring in people that meet real skills needs for their local economies. So I just think a bit of creativity here could enable us to get to a place where we've got the basic right openness at UK level, but where we can supplement that at a devolved level for our own particular demographic and skills needs.
Yeah, I think we would be keen to see not the devolution of immigration as such, but devolution of parts of the immigration system, like the ability to have Scottish-specific visas within a UK-wide immigration system. This is something that is available in other states. It is something that there are examples of in the world, as Colin has mentioned, and it is something that we have done to a certain degree in Scotland in the past through the Fresh Talent Initiative. And the STUC does believe quite strongly that we do need to be able to respond to the challenges that exist within the Scottish economy, and they are somewhat different to some of the challenges that might exist in other parts of the UK, I think primarily due to levels of rurality and specific skills needs that we might have here in Scotland. We also think that it's important that through the process of Brexit that clarity is given to EU workers about their future status. I think that still, despite some of the statements that have been made, I think there's still a lot of anxiety around. There's still a lot of uncertainty around for EU workers going forward, and that's also difficult for employers, and we're seeing employers now becoming nervous about employing EU workers, maybe making a different choice because they're not sure about whether or not that worker will still be available to work for them in 2 years or in a year and a half or whenever it might be. And I think that's a really negative situation and one that is already having an impact on our economy. And so the quicker we see certainty in this area, the better. And in our view, we do need a system that allows some degree of freedom of movement.
Grateful. Just a very quick...
We've only got a few minutes left, so okay, maybe not, but just to let you know that like we have done a lot of work in this committee on immigration-related issues with post-study work schemes and our inquiry and demography and population. And I wouldn't be too surprised if it was an issue that we're likely to return to, given again the very strong representation we've had on this issue. But I know Christine's got another question on this, which maybe Colin could address. Christine.
Well, actually, and Alistair has already touched on it. The Scottish Government have stated that there's consensus in Scotland that we need a return to the post-study route. What are the barriers that you perceive to that at the moment? But also, as well as the post-study route, we have academics who are going to be affected by changes in immigration policy. What do you see as the barriers and the dangers there?
I think just dealing with academics first, I just think we need to get to certainty quickly. I mean, while, as Helen says, UK government is now making more positive noises since the Florence speech about EU citizens' right to remain. Nonetheless, the last published policy is a settled status policy, which is quite unsettling, frankly, because unless you've been in the UK at a certain cut-off date, you don't know what your entitlement will be. If you're a sort of academic who has to travel to do field work overseas, go to conferences, all that, you don't spend 180 days in the country. You know, what on earth is your status going to be? So at least the current published policy is one that's profoundly unsettling, and we think as part of the EU negotiations there needs to be a better published policy on the table that explains to EU citizens what their rights of residence and also their rights of access to public services for them and their dependents are going to be when Brexit happens. It's troubling a lot of people. On post-study work, what are the obstacles? Well, the first obstacle is simply political. It's that UK government has historically, over the past few years, just not wanted to do it. Simple as that. There are perfectly resolvable administrative issues about how do you track where a worker is, but that's not beyond the wit of government to solve.
Do you want a quick contribution, Colin?
No.
All right, okay. Anything further on the immigration issue? Fine, Christine. Ross Thompson.
Thank you very much, Convener. Just a couple of questions on trade. I know the SEUC and also the FSB in their submissions talked about trade internationally. What do you think the UK's trade policy priorities should be after we leave the European Union?
I think practicality, and think about not what it's going to be like for a large car manufacturer to access the markets they need, but how does somebody who possibly has is a self-employed individual or maybe has one or two members of staff, what's it actually going to be like for them? I mean, one of the interesting things that we did a report on this last year. And one of the interesting things that came out of that was just the extent to which the single market is like a training ground for really ambitious small businesses that want to export to the world, because it's relatively easy, certainly compared to places outside the EU. It's a good place to cut your teeth. So something that would help people make that first step and address those practical issues would be really helpful if we want to raise the, I think it's about 14% of Scottish small businesses that currently export. If we want to get that up, then that's where we need to be looking.
Yeah, I think this is quite a complicated question in many ways. I think the first priority needs to be a trade agreement with the EU itself. But we can't be limited by that, because obviously we have to date been trading on EU trade policies with other places in the world. So I think to a certain degree there's just a prioritisation piece of work that needs to be done, because trade agreements take quite a long time to do, and we need to make sure that we replace the important ones first for our economy, and that I think is going to be quite a challenging and time-consuming issue. And I think there's a real danger for communities within this, on the basis that a lot of trade policy we've seen recently has been quite negative. It has the potential to remove sort of the ability to invest in public services, the ability to protect public services. I speak specifically about the ISDS investor clauses within TTIP, for example. And TTIP was the one that everybody holds up as being kind of iconic, but these are things that are repeated in trade deals, a whole range of trade deals, and that sort of private justice for private companies is something that we're very, very concerned about. But we're also concerned about the fact that it'll be very difficult for the UK to negotiate good trade policy alone. I think the EU, because just basically size and the big market that you were getting access to, actually had more ability to stand up against the kind of issues that were coming in a deal with Canada or in a deal with the US than we do potentially as Britain, particularly when we've got a kind of requirement to agree these deals quite quickly. So there is a real danger here that we'll have trade policies that kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and potentially put at risk some of the things that we hold quite dear here in the UK, and potentially cause a challenge for regulation and for workers' rights as well.
On the business side and supporting small, medium-sized businesses to take on the opportunities that new trade deals will present, what do you think needs to be put in place to help support that? Just as an example, as you know, through the Great Campaign, etc., there's about the government doubled the amount of export finances available to 5 billion. Yet the advertising round about that just isn't there. So what more needs to be done to show businesses that, one, there's help out there, but two, what else do they need to help take advantage of those opportunities that will come?
Well, one of the things that we suggested at a joint meeting between UK and Scottish ministers was some sort of coordinated sort of joint approach between Scottish and Westminster governments, because I think obviously parts of this fall into each of their remit. So if we could align some of that a bit better and make sure that we've got everyone, not just at that top end that you're talking about, and maybe the people that Alistair represents, spin-outs from universities and stuff, but right down at the level of a member who does knitting patterns from a croft on an outer island. At that level, what support is it that they need? And and for them, the primary source of advice for them would be something like Business Gateway. So how is that all integrated and right up to the sort of level that you're talking about?
Sure. Okay.
Grateful. Well, thank you for that. I mean, the only thing I'd make a plea is if any of your members or associated organisations would like to feed back into this committee, we're open for any suggestions, but that's really got us off to a very helpful start, and thank you for coming. I know you're all regular contributors to the work of the Scottish Affairs Committee, and just thank you for your ongoing interest in the work, and anything further that you've got, please submit to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can we have the next panel, please? Colleagues, we've only got 3 people down for questions, so just catch my eye if you want to come in with something.
Sorry,
Well, thank you very much for coming along to our inquiry, My Scottish Affairs. We'll maybe just get straight down to business, just say who you are, what organisation you represent, and maybe give us a few suggestions about the type of work you think that we should look at in the course of this Parliament. We'll start with you, Mr Gowans.
I'm Rob Gowans, I'm Policy Officer at Citizens Advice Scotland. I think two particularly the issues that we think would be useful for the Scottish Affairs Committee to consider in relation to welfare and social security. The first is the ongoing rollout of universal credit to Scotland. So it's one of the biggest policy changes to affect social security since its establishment. And it's already had quite a profound effect on the in the local authority areas where it's been rolled out. Citizens Advice Scotland, along with other organisations, has called for the rollout to be paused so that several issues related to it can be fixed. These include the 6-week wait for a first payment, digital access issues, issues with official errors that can delay payments even further, and issues with the helpline to the Universal Credit Support Centre, which is charged at which isn't a free phone number and has caused problems for people running out of phone credit when trying to call it, or running up large bills. The other area which I think would be interest is the devolution of social security powers to the Scottish Parliament, and in particular joint working arrangements between the UK and Scottish Government to facilitate those powers being used. So this can include information sharing, changes to benefits, reserve benefits that have an impact on devolved benefits, and vice versa, and just ensuring that the sort of the process is smooth and there isn't impediments in the way of the powers being used, or areas where there's gaps left in the shared space that is the social security policy.
Just to let you know that we did do a joint session with our equivalent committee in the Scottish Parliament, where we questioned the Secretary of State and the Cabinet Secretary, as well as, I think, CAB gave us some assistance in that inquiry too. So I think it's work that we will continue to look at. Any, again, suggestions about how that could be progressed would be very interested. Ms. Steiner.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Leila Tyner from Disability Agenda Scotland. I'm going to flip it round really briefly and first of all talk about employment. So I think there's some really interesting things that you could be looking at around employment and how the UK government and policies are interacting with Scottish Government and what's happening up here. I mean, from our perspective, specifically around the disability employment gap, the UK government for several years was talking about and calling for halving the disability employment gap. That's relatively recently changed to getting 1 million disabled people into work. The Scottish Government last December made a call to at least halve the disability employment gap. And there have been some measures from the UK government and also from the Scottish Government, but actually progress to work towards that has been quite limited. And without, say, targets or greater investment, we would say, in employment programmes, for instance, to help people into work and to stay in work, whether that be full-time paid employment, voluntary or part-time, could be very interesting. Part of that would be looking at access to work, which is a UK-wide policy and remains reserved. So whilst the employment support programmes have been devolved and contracts were recently announced for Scotland, access to work remains reserved. It's a way of disabled people accessing funding for reasonable adjustments. So the impetus isn't on the employer, it's to help them and the employer make reasonable adjustments that can help them be in work and stay there. And actually it's been described as best kept secret of the UK government. It's like there's quite low awareness of access to work. So there's a job there around promotion and getting, say, employers in particular, but also disabled people aware of what is available in a way that is easy to access and that they just simply know it's there. We also believe anecdotally that the number of people applying for access to work in Scotland is lower than arguably it should be in terms of the number of disabled people there are. But we're looking more into that in terms of research to better understand if that's the case or whether that's just anecdotal. There's also potentially a role for the public sector, so taking a leadership role in terms of contracts and recruiting disabled people. And then in terms of social security and welfare reform, as Rob said, looking at how the Scottish Government and the devolution of social security is working with the UK Government and English, Welsh kind of welfare. Part of that is that some of the powers that are being devolved, particularly around disability benefits, but other benefits as well, won't come into implementation for another 3 to 4 years. So we would say there's still an opportunity for looking at improvements that could be made at UK level around, say, PIP, personal independence payments. making a halt to universal credit, which will remain reserved, and also employment support allowance, which again will remain reserved. Lastly, I think just to briefly touch on things that are much more broader, so stigma and discrimination is something that underpins a lot of the issues that we work on, and also Brexit, and what that means for people and what that means for organisations.
Mr Wilson.
Hi there, I'm Craig Wilson. I'm from the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations. We're the membership organisation for the third sector in Scotland, and as such we hear from sort of across the spectrum a variety of charitable organisations. For example, Rob and Layla's organisations, we hear quite specific detail from them, and as a result we have the sort of fortune of seeing a bird's eye view of what the situation is in terms of welfare and social security. Certainly a catch-all statement for our members would be the continued benefit freeze and the decision to de-link from inflation. That's certainly causing an issue around the adequacy of benefits. And we saw today that inflation is predicted to reach a 5-year high, and with Brexit, and if there is a negative impact on the economy, which we've yet to fully see, that would certainly have an impact on the level of benefits that people are receiving, which they're already finding hard to get by on. So that would be a problem that we're hearing from across the membership. We've got concerns about DWP delivery, and there's plenty to be learned from the DWP. They do lots of great work, but there are some areas which could perhaps be better. I'm thinking specifically about people being allowed access to volunteering. Instead of maybe just working in the back room of a shop, they could be working for a charity and learning some meaningful skills and contributing in a different way. So we've got various concerns, but it's a sort of overarching position that we have.
Thank you for that. Christine Jarton.
A couple of things I wanted to ask. Was the CAB, you have in your report, Rob, your written submission, you're concerned about the levels of rent arrears, about PIP delays. One of the things which has come up elsewhere is that people with continuing degenerative conditions like motor neurons are being asked to go back for repeat appointments. How significant a problem is this? And do you feel that the system, which you've said yourself you would like to see frozen and isn't really working effectively, is contributing to those delays?
I think there's a few issues there. We certainly support the changes to the assessment processes for people whose conditions aren't going to improve, that are degenerative, so that people don't need to be repeatedly reassessed, particularly in relation to PIP. And we've suggested to the Scottish Government that when disability benefits are devolved, that to make much better use of existing evidence from people, whether it's their own evidence or it's their own medical evidence, to avoid unnecessary assessments. I think in terms of universal credit, I think it's something that's potentially part of the mix. We know that there's long delays for people waiting for a work capability assessment, and I think it impounds several of the other issues contributing to a rise in people seeking crisis support, whether that's from the Scottish Welfare Fund or being referred for a food parcel.
And in terms of the future devolution of welfare and benefits, where do you think there would be an advantage to future areas which could be devolved? Are there any disadvantages, or do you think there's specific areas that we should perhaps be looking at?
I suppose in terms of where there's particular areas in terms of working together, particularly around such as the flexibilities for universal credit. So the Scottish Government will have powers to administrative powers to change for particular elements of universal credit, the frequency of payments, whether payments are split, whether to impose a bedroom tax or not, and those areas I think are ones which rely on really good information sharing. There are other areas that, for instance, the Scottish Government is planning to create a carer supplementary payment that would raise carers allowance to the level of job seekers allowance, to make sure that it doesn't have any knock-on impacts on any other reserve benefit payments people make, or doesn't change their income for those purposes. That if payments are increased, then people would get the money in their pockets and it wouldn't be taken away elsewhere.
Yeah, if I just briefly build on a couple of the comments that were just around those questions. So most people who are currently on disability living allowance haven't moved over to PIP.
Yeah.
But already we're seeing some of these problems around the assessment process and around the quality of decision making, arguably. So some of that was the part of the rationale from the UK government to move people over from DLA to PIP was to be more efficient and to reduce the amount that was being spent. Firstly, because there's more face-to-face assessments, we would argue that actually it's not a particularly efficient system. There is an inherent cost associated with assessing someone face-to-face, particularly when there is enough medical evidence or other evidence in their written assessment. So there's definitely something there that could be looked at. And as you say, with certain conditions, and quite a few conditions, people aren't going to change. It might be that they get worse, it might be that they get better, but for instance, somebody who's registered blind, that is unlikely to change anytime soon. Yeah. So getting them back every few years to have a face-to-face assessment is not necessarily efficient. There are other ways of doing that, even if it's just having to complete a form again. And in terms of further devolution, employment support allowance could be something that's looked at. So there are more disabled people on employment support allowance than are on the disability-specific benefits. And actually, it's going to get increasingly more complicated with the two systems. And the welfare social security system is inherently technical and complicated. But that is one area that potentially further devolution, or certainly kind of very close working, I think will help the systems and people in the longer term.
Thank you, Chair. It's a question to Leila. Your introduction was very comprehensive, so thanks for that. And I just wanted to touch on, you mentioned discrimination against disabled people, and I know that one of the things this committee looked at in the past was access to justice, and how groups such as LGBT people and disabled people have faced barriers to that. I just wanted to ask you, is that still an issue, and what sort of challenges are there?
So there's a few things there. I think firstly, what's been interesting and quite disappointing is the figures for reporting of disability hate crime in Scotland have increased. So the COPFS figures for the last few years, year on year, for disability hate crime has gone up, but also that there is a really clear sense that it remains underreported. So even compared to other forms of hate crime, there is a belief that people aren't reporting it. Some of it might be that it's relatively low level, it doesn't class as hate crime. So there is a current inquiry in Scotland looking at hate crime legislation across the board. Some of it is also, it can vary where you are. So if you're in Glasgow, it might be a bit easier to report it than if you're in the Highlands, partly because smaller groups of people, do you really want to report on an employer or not being allowed into a shop with your guide dog when it's someone who lives down your street? It's very, very challenging, though, and I think it's quite challenging to look at stigma and discrimination anyway, because LGBT has moved on in really positive ways in the last 20 years, but that's not necessarily by doing a massive campaign. That's culture change, and how you really encourage culture change is probably by kind of some of these other areas like employment, like supporting people, inclusion, so that people are interacting in other ways. But that's a very top-line response to big issues.
Rob, you mentioned that you've called for the halt of the acceleration of universal credit. I just wondered if you could tell us in a bit more detail what your concerns are and what changes you think need to be made so that the system suits the needs of claimants. And we saw the letter which was signed by many third sector organisations in Scotland. Craig, perhaps you can tell us if you think that is the view of the third sector in Scotland.
Yeah, I think in particular the areas that that we would be particularly keen to see see addressed would be the 6-week wait for the first payment. Our evidence has shown that for far too many people this is leading to being in rent arrears, in debt, requiring emergency payments, advance payments they then need to repay by the time they get their first payment, and it's leaving them in sort of quite a detrimental effect on their mental health and their well-being as they're trying to juggle paying for food, bills, and rent. We think that period should be reduced, potentially by making a payment halfway through that it doesn't need to be repaid, by removing the waiting days to start of a claim. So that's basically 7 days that where there's no payment made, to give people that bit faster. We think there'd be workarounds making it easier for people to make a claim who struggle with digital. Over the last 4 years, we've regularly surveyed CAB clients and found that consistently 20% of people felt they'd be unable to make and manage a claim for benefits at all, even with help online, and the majority would struggle and need assistance to do so. So we think that would be done in terms of ongoing digital support. That's particularly around people available to train people, whether it's in libraries and in the job centre or other areas. But also there's additional routes to help to manage and make a claim in the first place, because whilst we support the aim of improving people's digital skills to help make them more employable, having that barrier at the start of a claim so that it can cause delays and problems for people getting money in the first place isn't especially helpful for that. And I think as part of that would be making the helpline number a free phone number. Previously, benefit numbers have been free phone, which has helped people resolve problems, particularly where there can be sort of long waiting times. And what we're seeing increasingly is people running out of phone credit, having to come to services such as the CAB to use the phone, which we're happy to help to do. But it's in the first month since universal credit was introduced in Musselburgh, the first rollout area, their phone bill increased dramatically, which isn't sustainable.
Danielle? Okay.
That's fine, thank you.
John Matt.
I just had a question about the delivery of universal credit. I think you've all raised concerns about how it's being rolled out. Now, clearly the policy objective behind this reform is to make the payment of benefits simpler and also to encourage people back to work. And I wondered if, notwithstanding your concerns about the delivery of it, do you agree with the policy objectives behind it?
Yes, we agree with that the benefit system should be made simpler and it should and the work should be made to pay. And I think there's laudable aims behind universal credit, which we've always supported, and that's why suggested that it's right to pause it to fix these problems, because I think it's in the best interest of everybody that universal credit works and that it works for the claimants in terms of giving them the basic social security support as well as the other aims.
And do others agree?
Yeah, actually you slightly preempted my response to Danielle's question, which was that the aim behind it was laudable. The simplification of welfare was something that was welcomed, but the rollout of it and the adequacy of the benefit itself are the issues. And the only other thing, just to pick up on, I agreed with everything that Rob said. That's certainly what we're hearing from our members. There was another issue around split payments for households where there are two people, and it was brought up by domestic abuse charities, which was that you both have access to the same account and you're able to see where the other person's going for job interviews and such like. So that was another issue as well, about sort of privacy and allowing people their own profile as well, which was another concern.
Really briefly, I think we supported the aim of simplification. I think that there's always been a question mark about how much the introduction of universal credit would help people back into work without other support and without being able to access, say, job centres, just because of some of the most vulnerable groups who are applying for universal credit if they're set back by 6 weeks, and also are probably a little bit away from the jobs market in the first place. We've always had question marks about that, and I think some of that's showing through, which is again why we supported the Citizens Advice call to halt it in order to look at some of that.
This committee in the last session, as I said, did some joint work with the Social Security Committee of the Scottish Parliament, and we looked at issues to do with the management about the preparedness of the devolution aspects of, and looking at the ways that governments could work together. Is there anything in specific that, you know, out with the process-related issue that we could usefully look at when it comes to the whole range of benefit, with the understanding that the Scottish Parliament are going to have responsibility for nearly all disability-related benefits and the management of universal credit? Is there any, I mean, could you make any concrete suggestions to us about the sort of things that we might be able to take up? I mean, we've had a number of responses about universal credit, for example, but are these just transient concerns, or is there a deep-seated feature that we need to examine and look at? Mr. Gowans, could you help us with that one?
I think if they had to, I think probably just examining specifically the rollout as it affects Scotland. See, there'll be impacts on local authorities, on local third sector agencies in Scotland. And I think in particular one area that might be looked at is housing. As we've seen from, I think, every area that the universal credit's been rolled out in both north and south of the border, rent arrears have increased dramatically for housing associations and local authorities, with a significantly higher proportion of housing in Scotland being social housing. That's potentially going to have sort of quite a significant impact. So that may be one area to particularly focus on, as well as the sort of the impact on kind of the local services in the areas where it's been rolled out.
Ms. Steiner?
I'm struggling to beyond what we've suggested in terms of particular areas to look at. I think there could be something really interesting, which is much more broader, which is around the purpose of social security and welfare, and how the two systems, what are the aims of the systems, and because the tone is very different of what is being suggested. Obviously, with the social security bill before the Scottish Parliament, we will have to see what that means in practice. But looking at how the Scottish system is developing, more from more of a top-line perspective across the board, and underneath that, some of these other benefits that potentially might be better placed being devolved, because when the Scotland Act was being looked at, it was people were looking at such a range of issues that maybe things were missed or were chosen not to be devolved that might be better placed.
And Mr. Wilson, just lastly, is there any specific Scottish issues that we should maybe be looking at and picking up, which is maybe different to the rest of the UK when it comes to welfare and social security?
I can't think of anything specific, but I would say that maybe the relationship between the UK and the Scottish sectors, in terms of information sharing and the IT systems and the flexibility in that, could be looked at as well, where if the Scottish Government are choosing to do something different, it should be facilitated in the easiest possible way. But I know that there's huge issues around that, but certainly that seems to be a problem that's come up several times.
Well, unless Ed and my colleagues have any further questions, we're very grateful to you and thank you for that. We've had lots and lots of good suggestions when it's come to welfare-related issues, so I'm sure we'll be considering them at length. But thank you for your time this morning. May we have the next panel, please? Good morning, and it's always good to see our friends from Agriculture and Fisheries at the Scottish Affairs Committee. And environment, yes, of course. How remiss of you, Mr Dundas. But we want to welcome, and I think you've all contributed in the work of this committee over the course of the past few years, and to which we're grateful. Maybe just to help the committee once again, who you are, what you represent, and anything by way of a short introductory statement about what we may want to look at. And we'll start from right to left this time. So, Mr Collins, you go first.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Good to be here. Good to see David also, particularly with his fishing interests, particularly predominant. I work for the Shetland Fishermen's Association. Shetland's miles away from anywhere, but right in the middle of the UK's fishing grounds, of course. In that function, I'm also part of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation on the executive committee there. So we've been wrestling, obviously, since Brexit, since the referendum, with what this might mean and so on. You'll be aware of the Sea of Opportunity campaign that we put out, pointing out that unlike many other sectors, of course, it's very much a win-win for the catching sector, the prospects after Brexit, in terms of wrestling fairer shares of the quota that's in our waters, and in terms of better management to a more sustainable regime. As far as this committee is concerned, this is the very wealth of our fisheries actually creates something of a conundrum, if I can put it that way. The fishing industry in the UK is very, very much distorted, if you like. It's very much towards the northeast of Scotland and Shetland. If I just concentrate on finfish, and I call them finfish, fishy fish, I am not talking about shellfish, which are very much more spread around the UK. If we talk about just finfish, 70% of UK landings by UK vessels are into Peterhead, into Fraserburgh and Shetland. So it's a massive concentration of the UK's fishing effort, if you like, is in this part of the world, or the northeast of Scotland and Shetland. When the UK leaves the EU and becomes a coastal state, and we have UK frameworks, the one concern we would have is how do we ensure that the Scottish dimension, which is particularly important in the UK whole, how is that protected, if you like? How is that spoken for in the right proportion? DEFRA would be the lead agency, you'd imagine, on fisheries questions. As the UK facing outward, of course, there are many devolved powers within the UK. But as the UK goes forward and negotiates quotas on the international stage, and as it contributes to environmental legislation, let's say, under various UN bodies, how is it, or how can we make sure that Scottish element, that uniquely kind of that very, very heavy Scottish dimension to UK fisheries is properly represented? At the moment, and it's early days so far, DEFRA officials, of course, they talk to Marine Scotland officials and discussing and preparing for the post-Brexit world. But that rather leaves us just hoping that officials always get on. What is there, or could there be any institutional safeguard to make sure that 70%, if you like, if those interests are properly represented in the UK's position? And I just have a suggestion. I don't have any answers, but a suggestion for you, perhaps, whether it's appealing or not, is there, and it's an open question, is there a role for the Scotland office here to ensure that whenever DEFRA, for example, takes a UK position on fisheries, and on other things too, agriculture obviously, is there a role for the Scotland office to ensure, as a backstop, to check with DEFRA, have you spoken to Marine Scotland, have you spoken to the Scottish Parliament, have you taken on board the Scottish Government's views on this? And I wonder if there's some institutional backstop, and therefore with yourselves as well, making sure this is actually happening as we go forward.
Grateful. We have got the Scotland Office Ministers in front of this committee in the next couple of weeks, and I'm pretty certain that question will be noted as one that will possibly be put to the Ministers. Ms Slipper.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for having me here today. I last gave evidence to this committee, I think, almost exactly a year ago, and where we talked about Brexit, and I outlined at that point that the key priorities for NFU Scotland were three very large overriding themes: trade, labour for the sector after we leave the EU, and a new agricultural support system after we leave. Since then, nothing has changed. These are still our key priorities as we move forward, although clearly the situation is beginning to solidify in that we are seeing more from UK government on their negotiating priorities. The Prime Minister has confirmed that we will be seeking to leave the single market and the customs union, and we're chewing through white papers on those two themes at the current time. We remain absolutely resolute on three key things. First of all, on trade, if indeed we are to be leaving the single market, and we were quite clear during the campaign that our preference would be to remain in it, but if we are to leave, we must have frictionless and barrier-free trade with the EU. The free trade agreement has got to protect provenance of UK and Scottish products. We're very, very concerned about some of the developing narrative about a no-deal situation, or a situation where we might revert to unilateral trade liberalisation, or indeed reverting to WTO rules as well. The provenance of our product has got to be protected, and standards must be equivalent. And the FTA must also account for different sectors of the agricultural sector, because different sectors will need and want different things and will have different priorities. On the labour point, again, this is growing increasingly more critical. We've got to have access to both skilled and competent. We prefer to use the phrase competent rather than unskilled. So skilled and competent labour for on-farm and off-farm positions, and there's a seasonal and a permanent dimension to that as well. We've got to take much more of account of what switching off that steady stream of labour into the UK will mean for businesses and the economy in Scotland. And finally, this is a key thing for us, is a future agricultural support policy for Scotland after we leave the EU that incentivises action rather than inertia. We want that new policy to balance financial stability payments with wider, more outward-looking things, increasing productivity and environmental benefits as well, of course. And we want the same quantum of funding to be put into that policy, at least, that we currently have, and for that to be ring-fenced. I mean, this is absolutely key to the longer-term sustainability of the industry. So I think we'll touch on frameworks after, so I'll leave my comments on that until then.
Grateful. Mr. Dundas. Thank you. I'm Charles Dundas. I'm the Vice Chair of Scottish Environment Link, which is an umbrella body that brings together all the environmental NGOs, organisations such as the National Trust, the RSPB, the Scottish Wildlife Trust, and my own organisation, the Woodland Trust. If you will excuse me, I'm a late substitution to this committee. The chair of our governance group, Lloyd Austin from RSPB, is inconveniently out of Edinburgh, as is Daphne Valastari, our advocacy officer. So I hope the committee will excuse me if my pitch is not as slick or as informed as either of theirs would have been. But I'm sure we can get by with a more conversational, discursive way of engaging. I think, like the farmers, we have three main concerns born out of Brexit. So much of the environmental protection that we enjoy at the moment finds its roots in environmental legislation, regulation, and institutions. Therefore, the way we extract ourselves from those is of great interest to us. So we are concerned by the withdrawal bill currently going through Parliament, namely three things that are absent from that. One of which are environmental principles. These are the principles which are enshrined within EU treaties but are not being translated into UK law. Things like the precautionary principle or the polluter pays. So we find the absence of those very concerning at the moment. The second point is what we've dubbed the governance gap, which comes from extracting ourselves from the institutions of the EU. So there are examples whereby environmental protection is safeguarded through certain European institutions, such as the Commission, which will in UK law only then be replaced by parliamentary scrutiny, judicial process, not necessarily the correct vehicles to get the best outcomes in those cases. And then finally, the issue of frameworks. I would absolutely echo what Claire said about land management payments. This is an opportunity for us to reform the cap system that I'm sure a lot of people would say needed a lot of reform. I would agree with Claire that we need the same amount of money coming into it, particularly in Scotland. But the key issue on this is how Scotland plays its part in creating those frameworks, how all four nations of the UK get together to have a mutually agreed framework that works for all and provides the best benefits.
That was sufficiently slick, Mr Dundas, so thank you for that. John Lamont.
Thank you, Chairman. My question is to Claire and the NFU. In your written submission regarding Brexit, you suggest that policy levers over such things like farming support should be devolved, but you suggest that there should be a common regulatory framework across the UK. And I just wondered if you could expand a bit more about what you mean by that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, clearly, since 1999, agriculture has been devolved to the Scottish Government. What's also clear, though, is that cutting and pasting the CAP and into UK policy is not easy, because it's not. I mean, it's a devolved policy, but it's also been vastly Europeanised, and it's all tied up in regulations and in money, which are not easy things to unpick. But as you rightly say, what we've had under the CAP is we've all played the same rules of the game. It was put quite nicely to me recently that we're not operating on a level playing field at the current time, but we're all playing the same rules of the game. So the way that CAP works at the current time is that the four parts of the UK have significant inbuilt flexibility to devise the policy in a way that fits the particular agricultural context. So, for example, in Scotland, we make use of less favoured area payments and coupled payments for the livestock sectors, and that's something that that's flexibilities that aren't used elsewhere in the UK. So we really want to be able to retain that significant flexibility, but it's got to be, there needs to be some sort of framework for things, areas of regulation that cut across borders. So some examples might be, and I think I outlined this in the submission, things like animal welfare, plant protection, pesticides, chemical regulation. It wouldn't make any sense for us to go in four different directions in the UK on these areas, because indeed it's likely that the regulatory framework will be fairly closely aligned to what the EU is doing anyway, because we're proud to have strong protections in these areas, and we'll need to maintain areas of commonality with the EU. But within that commonly agreed framework, and major emphasis on commonly agreed, I would back up what you said there, there's got to be then significant devolved flexibilities to do things in different ways in Scotland, fitting to the
just
context.
So clear, for those areas that are being retained for the UK framework, that means they should be held by the UK Parliament, those policy areas?
I think it's probably, it's an issue of semantics, and I'm not a constitutional expert on where exactly these powers will come back to and where they sit. But I think what we've seen, clearly we've hit a deadlock because there is disagreement between the UK and the Scottish governments as to where the powers will come back to on day one of EU exit. For us, I think it's not so much about where those powers sit, but it's the regulation being done correctly, and there being significant agreement and consultation before the framework is applied between the different parts of the UK. So whether that's done through some sort of emulated UK Council of Ministers, for example, or the existing joint ministerial framework, I don't know how it would best work, but there needs to be more engagement at the current time between the four parts, rather than it being a drop-down, DEFRA-centric view of the world, because we're quite clear that won't work for Scotland, and indeed it's quite unlikely to work for England and Wales and Northern Ireland as well. Okay.
And my second question was just a more general question. Notwithstanding the huge financial support which farmers get from the European Union, many farmers have voted to leave the European Union. And I just wondered if you can shed any light on which aspects of the European Union that annoyed farmers so much, which resulted in them voting to leave, and what do we need to reform to ensure that they feel as if they're getting a better deal now compared to what they had before?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to go back a step, I mean, clearly Brexit is one of the biggest challenges that we've faced as a union in the 100 or so years since we've been in existence. But there are some opportunities that come from leaving the EU if we get the trading framework and labour requirements done correctly and have a proper discussion about how we want to support the industry via a newly redrawn policy framework, then that will benefit. There's areas of regulation as well that we want to look at. We've recently published a document looking at post-Brexit regulatory change because we do see this as an opportunity. Obviously, farming is highly regulated at the current time, and rightfully so in many areas. It's important that we establish that. But we have identified various different areas of regulation where it's just not working in the Scottish context. And I think it's these areas that particularly annoyed some of our members who voted to leave. And I think there is an opportunity for us to look at those areas and not have a bonfire of regulation, don't get me wrong, but to look about how we can redraw things to make them work better. So some examples might be the penalty matrix and inspections, mapping requirements under the CAP, the 3-crop rule, arguably doesn't work in the Scottish context. So we want to see about how these ill-tailored and ill-fitting areas can be done better. As I say, it's not about a bonfire of regulation. In fact, there's opportunities to perhaps introduce more regulation in areas such as food labelling, food procurement, so we can do more to support the Scottish brand and that sort of thing. But I think they are the opportunities from the situation.
Thank you.
Ross Thompson.
Thank you, Chair. Two quick questions following on from your presentation, Claire. At the start, you mentioned that the union was concerned about the recent discourse and talk around about a no-deal situation. And we all want the best deal for Scotland and the United Kingdom and the freest possible access to the EU single market. Would you not agree, though, that in trying to seek that best possible deal, there is a risk posed to that, as well as sort of adding to the inflexibility of EU negotiators? If we say, regardless of what's on the table in spring 2019, we'll take it, do you think there's a risk there? And two, has the appointment of a new minister now for no deal, putting the groundwork in to that scenario, given any reassurance as well to the union?
Good question. I think, to be quite honest, it's I think we're still dealing with a lot of hypotheticals. Even though I said in my opening remarks that some thinking has solidified, we still don't know the likelihood of the trading scenario. And it's not just about trade; it's about the regulatory framework as well. It's about us having a steady stream of people there able to work in the industry, and it's about us, certainly in the short to medium term, still having an element of direct support from government to keep businesses afloat in a very, what will be a very bumpy, few years. I think it's quite welcome that government has recognised the need to have some sort of transition, or I can't remember now what they refer to it as, a time-limited implementation phase, I think the phrase is. And we will need that because farming is a long-term industry. Decisions are being made now that will impact the business in 3 to 4 years' time when we're out of the EU. So we really need to start seeing a lot more solid thinking about what the trading framework will be. As to the appointment of a new minister, do you mean Michael Gove?
No, Steve Baker.
Oh, right, okay, yes. Yeah, we'll be seeking to meet with them and make our priorities known. As I say, the situation is tied up in quite a lot of politics at the moment in terms of some of the difficulties overpowers between UK and Scottish Government, and we need to start moving on from that and having a fuller discussion about policy.
Sure. We covered trade briefly just in the last sort of the first section. In terms of priorities for trading from your own sector, as we break down barriers to trading in other parts of the world, where do you see the opportunities there in terms of maybe exporting and round about food and drink? I don't know if those are the areas you'd be looking at, but what would you see as the trade priorities for your industry following Brexit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let me be clear, Scotland and actually the UK, we're never going to compete on a sort of stack it high and sell it low commodity basis. Our industry is very much based upon provenance, exacting standards. We're pleased to shoot over the mark when it comes to the very, very high standards that our farmers maintain, and that's something that's got to be protected. If we get that right and we're not undercut by cheaper food imports, which will be hugely damaging to the sector, then I can see major opportunities in new markets abroad, China, India, for example. But we need our relationship with the EU to, certainly in the short to medium term, look pretty similar to how it is at the moment in terms of the flow of trade there, because otherwise we'll see quite a major restructuring in the industry.
Thank you.
Christine Jarden.
I was going to ask you actually about you've asked for a review of agricultural regulation, and just what areas you were thinking about. Now, you've mentioned that already. So as well as perhaps expanding on that a wee bit, could you tell us how, is the industry concerned about the possibility of the impact of a lack of a regulatory framework, which was similar to the EU having an impact on trade, as you said? I mean, how concerned are you about that? I'm thinking specifically about food quality standards. But if you could just expand first a wee bit more on the regulation, what you think is necessary.
Sure. Well, I can provide the committee after this session with a copy of the document that we've produced.
Please.
It basically, as I've said, it absolutely doesn't support there being a bonfire of regulation, but there are, as I've said, areas where it can be done better. Particularly, there's some areas of EU regulation where we feel they've been gold-plated and it's not actually brought about specific environmental gain or productivity gain or whatever it's seeking to achieve. So we want to have a good look at how we can get those areas to work properly for the industry and to actually benefit the environment and productivity in better ways. In terms of there being no regulatory, or in terms of the regulatory framework changing after we leave, a lot of that will be determined by the trade deals that we get, because if we end up, importing vast amounts of cheaper imported food that have been produced to a lower standard under different regulatory frameworks from non-EU countries, that will immediately put up a non-tariff barrier and kind of export our standards and regulatory frameworks away from Scotland and the UK, because we just won't be able to compete. So that is a major concern. Yeah. Okay.
Just to go back to the regulations again, possibly this is a danger for a question for Mr Dundas. Is there a danger that you would come into conflict with, if you were to change these regulations, is there a danger that the farming regulations would come into conflict with the environmental regulations, or that there's a need to make sure we don't undermine the relationship between agriculture and environment at the moment if we interfere too much with the regulations post-Brexit?
Yes, obviously no one wants conflict between environmentalists and farmers, but I think we're both agreed that there are changes that need to be made to the regulations. So yeah, I'm not going to pretend that it will be easy and we know exactly what they all are, but I think we've got a mature enough relationship.
So it's not necessarily, it's more of a joint approach, it's not necessarily a concern.
I certainly wouldn't advocate inaction for fear of the consequences.
Thank you.
We're going to get on to fisheries, but first a supplementary from Tommy Shepherd.
Yeah, well, I think maybe I'm taking this on to fisheries.
Oh, you take it on to... why don't we get David to ask a question first, and we'll come to you, Tony.
I want to go back to common frameworks.
Please.
So, good morning. And I think this is possibly a question to Mr Collins, so I'd be interested in the others as well. Going back to the discussion about common UK frameworks post-Brexit, I'm keen to know what the view of the Federation is in terms of where you think the centre of gravity should lie in any arrangements. I mean, it seems to me you could have one model where responsibility lies with DEFRA, but with a responsibility to consult with Scottish agencies and the Scottish fleet, or it could become the responsibility of a department of the Scottish Government with a requirement to operate within a statutory UK framework. Does the industry have a view as to which would be the most desirable in terms of protecting your interests?
Probably not. What it does have is probably a desire to have its cake and eat it. What it would like is for the UK to have the force, if you like, the weight of the UK facing outwards. That's very, very important. But would like Scottish interests, if you like, to be taken proper, due consideration within that. There are many, many stocks, for example, if you talk to the rather narrow area, if you like, of quoted negotiations. Some of our biggest some of Europe's biggest stocks lie within what we call Scottish waters. They're fished by the Scottish fleet. You would want, in any quota negotiation, the Scottish position on those stocks. I'm thinking mackerel, for example, or it could be haddock or North Sea cod, where there's a particular very, very heavy Scottish interest in there, that to be absolutely sure, and I don't know where you want to go as far as to call it a veto or anything else, but to be absolutely sure that the Scottish industry's wishes on those negotiations predominate in forming DEFRA's opinion. So that's really not a helpful answer, because it's not one or the other. It's making sure that Scottish voice is heard properly for the stocks where it dominates, but within a UK context, because there's a real value in having a UK heft, if you like, in international negotiations.
David Duguid.
Thank you, Chair. Hello again, Simon. As you mentioned in your opening statement, obviously there's a wide range of different fisheries around the UK and around Scotland itself. And of course the fish themselves don't necessarily hang around in the same place all the time. So it's quite a complex system that needs to be managed. And I think you've covered what I was going to ask about that in your previous answer, so thanks for that. So the SFF and other industry bodies have repeatedly said that regaining fishing rights in the UK coastal state is a priority. But can you say a bit more about how you see that working, and what kind of outcomes you want to see achieved from the negotiations?
Yes, there's two parts to it, if you like, to regaining control of what will become the UK's EEZ. The first part I mentioned earlier was to regain what we would regard as fairer shares of the quotas in our waters. And this refers back, and I think it's a generally accepted concept right across the UK and Scottish governments, that the long-term aim, not immediately, we couldn't probably cope with it immediately, the long-term aim would be to have shares of quotas in our waters that match what we call zonal attachment. So the proportion of stocks that are in our waters over time is broadly reflected in the quota shares. We would not be interested at all in setting autonomous quotas that flout scientific advice, for example. What we're looking at is the shares of internationally agreed amounts that you can take out of the sea. The critical part upon Brexit is our ability to extract a fairer deal on quotas is not compromised by us losing negotiating power. And the biggest thing we have in the context of fisheries to negotiate those better shares. I mean, nobody's going to give us better shares spontaneously. Why would they? Especially, as we've already said, we'd be constrained by the scientific advice. The really big lever we have is control of access. Almost 2/3 of the fish that are caught within the UK's EEZ disappears in other EU vessels, non-UK EU vessels. Many other fleets, the rest of the EU, desperately require access to our waters to catch their quotas. That gives us a very powerful lever that we're very, very keen is not traded away at any point during the exit process. There's no long-term deal, in other words, that safeguards EU fleets' existing quota shares, for example. That would immediately remove that ability. Any concession by the UK government over access, that again would be most unwelcome because we couldn't lever off those higher shares. That's one part of it. The longer-term part of it, which you wouldn't want to lose either, and perhaps in the long run even more important for the whole industry, is the ability to manage these seas, our seas, better. A lot of what Claire was saying earlier about regulation, we could say that's exactly the same for fisheries. We believe we could do a far better job, a far more reactive job to managing a dynamic sea in the UK than we could do from Brussels. So that could provide, or we're convinced it will provide, healthier stocks in the long run as well, and that's a long-term goal. Both of those things come from controlling our EEZ. So in a nutshell, as we come out of the EU, we don't want to lose any ability to do what we like, as it were, within that EEZ. Having already agreed the broad principles that we're not going to overstep scientific quotas, and we're going to manage things in a responsible way.
Okay. Well, you've actually gone on and answered one of my next questions, but I do have one other one, which is about the EU fisheries funding. So I think the number I've got here is 243 million euros between 2014 and 2020 being allocated, which is then matched by the UK government. What concerns do you have about the longer term future of that kind of funding post-Brexit?
And we're not, as a sector, we're not nearly as dependent on funding. We would love to have it, who doesn't, as other sectors. If I just put it more in my more local rather than Scottish context, in Shetland, we worked out, and it hasn't been worked out for Scotland as a whole, the precise balance, but the amount of funding from EMFF and its predecessor over the last 5 years has been worth less than 1% of the value of the fish caught within 50 miles of Shetland. So yes, it's a very, very nice add-on, but it's certainly not. We are certainly not a sector that depends on this kind of funding. We believe we're dynamic enough, especially after Brexit. If we do get the kind of quota shares we want, we're dynamic enough to be able to draw in investment in any case.
Okay, thank you.
And we are missing Bertie this morning, so pass our best regards to him when you see him next. Just a couple of questions just to round off this session is, we're pretty certain we'll be touching on frameworks in the course of our various inquiries as we progress through this Parliament, and we are speaking to the Scotland Office, and this will possibly be touched on in the course of that inquiry and in that evidence session. But as we go forward, I'm thinking of the NFUS, Claire, there's a couple of things that strike me that we could possibly touch on, and one would be the immigration question. I mean, I represent the finest berries in the whole of the UK in Perthshire, and my farmers have been coming to me obviously with great concerns just about the availability of labour. Maybe if there's something that we could touch on with that as we go forward. And secondly, about where we're going to be in 2020, 2021, given that we will be leaving the European Union, and the talk about the Barnett formulas possibly replacing what we get from CAP funding. And then we had Michael Gove talking about, like farmers being rewarded for greening and showing interest in that, and maybe the payments following that. I mean, is there things that we could start to look at that? Is there any issues that you've identified that we could do? Or, are these worthwhile touching on and addressing?
Yes, to take the latter point, first of all, funding frameworks, there's been a commitment from the Conservative Party in their manifesto that funding for farm support will be maintained up to 2022. We've written to the Secretary of State for DEFRA asking him to confirm exactly what that will entail in terms of Pillar 1, Pillar 2, and kind of does that also include environmental schemes funding? We're going on the assumption that it does. But you're quite right, after 2022, it'll be an entirely different ballgame, and we'll have, hopefully and presumably, a pot of money to distribute across the UK. We, as I've said in my opening remarks, we want that, at the very least, the same amount of funding coming back into Scottish agriculture, and for it to be ring-fenced. That's really important. Because we can just foresee the situation that if it is just a lump sum that's given, there are obviously other ongoing priorities in the economy, and when the schools needing built and hospitals, is the government going to prioritise agricultural support? That's a different debate for another day, but we are very keen that it's ring-fenced. We've done a little bit of modelling so far, and we're hoping to work with DEFRA to develop this a bit further about how we might look at allocating agricultural funding after we leave the EU. There's no perfect model as yet, but we have to be quite inventive and perhaps look at a hybrid model of a system based on land classification along with headage payments, but also making sure that it's WTO compliant. That's not the only answer, it's just we need to...
This could be... We could look at
and we need to
helping design
exactly,
some sort of shape for Scottish agriculture beyond that point.
Indeed, yeah. So we need to test it against different scenarios and different makeups of different businesses, because in Scotland we have a very diverse agricultural industry, and no business is the same really in terms of its operation. So it's a power of work that needs to be done there, and we're keen to get a discussion going with DEFRA on that. Coming back to the labour issues, you'll be aware, Pete, in particular, that it's becoming an increasingly pressing issue. I mean, clearly there's issues for permanent staff who are employed on a permanent basis and are very worried about their future. There's also a lot of questions being raised about turnover of staff. These people might not stay in Scotland. So if they leave, after we leave the EU, are we going to have a scheme in place to ensure that they can then...
Sorry to interrupt. You'll have seen the conclusions of the DEFRA Select Committee about introducing a new seasonal agriculture worker scheme. Is that something that NFUS would favour? Is there anything that we could look at specifically Scotland-wide with such a scheme?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been very clear from the outset that we want to see some sort of seasonal agricultural worker scheme put in place as soon as possible, because, again, you'll be aware that we've already seen some impact this growing season in particular. I spoke to a member last week, in fact, who is unable to pick up tons of broccoli from a field last week because literally just can't get the boots on the ground because people are not feeling welcome, and we're just not getting the same amounts of people coming over to Scotland to pick the fruit and veg in particular. So yes, we need to see some real movement from UK government sooner rather than later on how we might be able to satisfy the demand for the next growing season and after we leave the EU.
We consider some sort of inquiry into migration to Scotland. I'm pretty certain we'd be seeking your views particularly on this issue, and I know that you've been doing quite a bit of work on this, so hopefully if that is going to be progressed, you could be able to share your views on that. David Duguid.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask similar questions to Simon, really, mostly about the immigration issue. And I know there's, in the processing side of things, I know you're more involved in the catching side, but in the processing side of the fishing industry, I know there's a high dependency on not, as Claire said, it's not just the transient workers who come and go, the seasonal workers, but also the full-time workers. Have you got anything more to say on that from fisheries?
No, just I'd echo the same thing, David. Yes, it is a very serious concern along the processes. The catching sector is a different, it's a completely different situation. There is a dependence in the northeast of Scotland on migrant workers, but they tend to come from outside the EU, and that is not directly affected. But the processing sector would echo exactly what Claire just said. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Thanks.
Great. Just lastly, Mr. Dundas, given the cross-border nature of so many of these environmental issues and the disparity of responsibilities between Scottish Government and the UK Government, how do you envision the Scottish Government working together in these policies when, after Brexit, once all this is concluded?
Working together with the UK Government?
Indeed.
Yeah, well, we have the benefit within Scottish Environment Link of meetings with ministers on both sides, and I don't think I'm telling tales out of school if I tell you both of them, when we ask how's it going, both of them suck in some breath and say, well, it'd be going better if the other side would cooperate with us more. So, yes, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be, there's a cultural difficulty between the Scottish Government and the UK Government working together. But if we're going to have a common UK framework on land management payments, etc., then they have to work together, and they have to work with all four nations. I'm struck by the question Mr. Lamb and Mr. Shepherd asked about where the centre of gravity lies. And I would echo Claire's point, it doesn't really matter where the centre of gravity lies, because these frameworks have to be created on the basis of a parity of esteem. Therefore, if, for example, DEFRA was the lead body that was setting up this framework, if they were really serious about devolution, they would let the responsibility sit with Northern Ireland, and then it would have to work for a devolved network, because it would be out of their hands. There's an old way of, if you have to divide a cake between two people, you get one person to cut the cake and the other person to pick the slice they want. I think that's the sort of way of dividing up the cake that we need to be going down the line.
Thank you. Well, with that analogy, we'll maybe just leave it there. But thank you all very much again, and I'm sure we'll be hearing from you all in the course of the next couple of years as we shape up together our agenda. But thank you just now. Can we have the next panel, please? Good morning, and I think you've been quite familiar with the sessions we've had thus far, so maybe we'll just go through. We'll start from the middle this time. Who you are, and any particular things that you think that this august committee should be looking at in the course of the next few years. Ms Hunter.
I'm Susan Hunter. I'm the Senior Policy and Research Officer with YouthLink Scotland. YouthLink Scotland are the national agency for youth work. We're a membership organisation and intermediary for large national voluntary youth organisations, local authority, youth work services and some regional youth organisations and those who support the way we work. For example, our membership also includes Police Scotland. So what we're really interested in and hope that the committee would also share our interest in is around young people's views and experiences on Brexit and their life post-Europe, and in particular for the Youth Work Service around the funding which we attract and draw into investment for experiences for young people, but also for CPD development opportunities for youth workers and strategic relationships through the Erasmus Plus programme. So Erasmus Plus has a number of strands. One of those strands is youth. It was previously called Youth in Action, and around 10% of the Erasmus Plus funds are for that youth strand, and that works out at about €2 million euros in the past 7 years into youth organisations and experiences in Scotland, and that's not including where Scotland was the partner, where the funds may have gone to the lead partner in Sweden, for example, or another European programme country. We do recognise that increasingly youth work organisations are relying on Erasmus Plus funding and other European funds in addition or to replace national or local funds which may have previously been available in a context where youth workers are experiencing the need to do more with the same or with less, and as young people's needs increase. We're also very interested in the fact that young people's voices are not being heard within the negotiation process, and we think that's largely because there's a lack of reliable, credible information where youth workers can support young people to understand some of the challenges and opportunities that Brexit might provide them with. So we believe that young people are actually losing out on the right to information from the media, which is reliable and credible because the process has become so politicised. And our other area of interest is around young people's loss of rights and protections through the repeal bill, because a lot of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child protections sit within the EU Charter on Fundamental Rights, which wouldn't come down, and also with issue of factors not then being devolved onto Scotland, they wouldn't be covered under the Children and Young People's Act, which gives furtherance of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Grateful. Mr. Boyle.
Thank you very much. Good morning. This is a pleasure to be here at our first Scottish Affairs Committee speed dating. It's a great format. My name's
I wouldn't have put it so delicately as that, but thank you anyway.
I'm the Parliamentary and Policy Officer with BMIS Scotland, so I'll try and give you a very brief overview of where our interests reside at the moment in relation to devolved and reserved powers, and flag up a couple of issues which have manifested in the last couple of weeks around the topic of immigration, and lastly maybe chime a lot of what has already been said this morning in relation to Scotland's experience in the forthcoming leaving the European Union negotiations. Thank you. So BMIS are a race equality intermediary body, so we reside not too dissimilar to YouthLink. We work with diverse communities in Scotland in order to tackle a multitude of issues which they may face. So where we sit structurally is between the Scottish Government's Equality Unit and diverse ethnic and cultural minority communities in Scotland. So a lot of the policy areas which we take an interest in and deal with are devolved, but some key ones are reserved. Employment obviously is one, and immigration the other. In 2016, the Scottish Government launched the Race Equality Framework for Scotland from 2016 to 2030, which was a high-level strategic roadmap for progressing and challenging social change in Scotland in relation to inequalities faced by ethnic and cultural minority communities. And I'm sure the panel members are all aware that last week the Prime Minister released the race disparity audit, which covered data which was held by Westminster and other reserved functions. We would be interested for the committee to try to ascertain what the next steps are in relation to the race disparity audit. So the race disparity audit hasn't yet came to the point of creating a race equality framework, which is the strategic document which is going to lead in terms of where we're going next. So the audit's flagged up some discrepancies in relation to employment across the board. So we'd like to see how the Scotland office will enhance or complement Scotland's race equality framework in order to take that forward. Second point, we became aware last week, we were given sight of a Freedom of Information request which had been taken forward by the Scottish investigative journalism website called The Ferret, which enabled us to see stop and searches which have taken place in Glasgow in relation to immigration status. Over 80% of those stopped were British citizens. In numerical numbers, that was 1,501 people who have been searched in Glasgow over the last 5 years. As I've just alluded to, the vast majority of them are British citizens. Now, the question that we would have with regards to that is what are the policy and procedures being taken forward by the UKBA and what are supposed to be intelligence-led stop and searches that such a high number of British citizens are being stopped in that regard. The concern there would be that there's an element of racial profiling going on. People are being identified by their a visible indicator and are therefore being followed through with these stop and search. So some clarity would be required as to what those procedures are moving forward and the role that this committee could play in assessing or analysing that to ensure that any stop and searches are actually taken forward with validity. In relation to the ongoing discussions to leave the European Union, we would like the committee to take a proactive role in terms of assessing the impacts for Scotland. Obviously Scotland's demographics are unique and different to the rest of the United Kingdom, and what may have an impact or what may be a rational negotiation position for the United Kingdom may not necessarily be the perfect fit for Scotland. So what I'm alluding to is that the largest community in Scotland who have coverage under the definition of race within the Equality Act would be our Polish community, 61,000. Additionally, we know from the Scottish Pupil Census supplementary data that the second most spoken language in Scottish schools is Polish, 15,000 speakers. So what we're talking about here is not necessarily a continually fluid, young, seasonal migrant. We're talking about people who are the backbone of Scottish communities who are well integrated.
Have to be, and lastly, unfortunately.
And finally, just to chime again with a colleague from YouthLink, we do a lot of European work with other European civic society organisations. A lot of that is therefore predicated on EU funding as to ascertain where that funding will then be, how we'll cover that shortfall post leaving the European Union.
Grateful. Thank you for that. Ms Fraser.
Good morning. My name is Evelyn Fraser. I'm the Development Manager of the Scottish Women's Convention. We're an organisation funded to consult with women in communities and use their voices to influence public policy. So we hold a number of events throughout the country, making sure that we include women from quite isolated communities and rural locations, and we always visit a Scottish island as well to make sure that women who are furthest away from the central belt have their voices included. Most of the issues that are discussed at our events are devolved matters, but there are kind of overarching reserved matters as well. One of the key areas is to do with employment, looking at kind of job security, the types of work that women do, 0 hours contracts are of great concern. We've held an event with young women which has looked at the types of contracts that young people are offered nowadays, but also the difference in the national minimum wage for young people. Young people feel as if they're being discriminated against because of their age with regards to the different pay ranges, particularly below the age of 25. We've also spoken to older women who have issues around the changing dates with relation to pension. They're having to work longer, but it's perceptions in the workplace of how how they can do their job, what skills they need, and then what kinds of jobs that they're being expected to do, and also the job security around that. Older women, again, have also spoken about the issue of pensions and when they can claim their state pension, but also their ability to save for a personal pension or to contribute to a company pension scheme. Women tend to be in low-paid, low-skilled jobs, which gives them less of an opportunity to save for retirement. And with the changing age at which women can retire, they're finding issues around kind of pension planning. Another issue that women have raised is around the gender pay gap, which is still very prevalent. I know the government this year has issued regulations around employers with more than 250 employees. There's a mandatory right that they have to purchase an equal pay audit. But in Scotland, there are a number of small employers who fall out with that 250 employee range, and women have no kind of backup to a pay audit without actually challenge their employer, which they find very difficult unless they have a trade union to support them with that. Around social security, women have issues which we heard about in one of the previous sessions around the current system of benefits and actually going to a job centre and the whole ethos around that, applying for benefits, being seen as scroungers. And we're working with the new social security team and the new agency to see how women's experiences could be used to change the new agency that's coming to Scotland. Women have also spoken about how they're portrayed in the media. This is a huge issue because the media has a huge role to play in society's view of women. Women make up 52% of the population, but there's still very ingrained ideas of what a woman's role is in society, in the home and in employment. But there's also very sexualised images, particularly of young women, which is impacting on their mental health and their ability to engage with society. We've done quite a bit of work around this, looking at social media and the impacts that that's having. Just finally on Brexit, we've held a couple of events on Brexit because we felt as if women's voices weren't being heard as part of the Brexit process. And as women are the cornerstones of communities throughout Scotland, it's very important that their voices are heard as part of the negotiations. Women feel as if that they're not getting information at the moment. It's still all very high level. There's nothing coming down to a kind of level that they feel they can contribute to. But they have fears around the withdrawal of European funding, particularly in isolated communities and for services which women access. They have concerns around withdrawal of European funding for infrastructure, for business start-up, for making sure that communities are coherent in Scotland. And they also have concerns around the withdrawal of rights that women have secured under European legislation over the past 20 to 30 years, particularly around maternity and parental rights. So that's just kind of the main issues that we're working on at the moment.
Grateful. Thank you very much for that. I've got a couple of supplementary questions from John Lamont and then Christine Jardine. John.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Evelyn Fraser and the Scottish Women's Convention. In your written evidence you mentioned it again just now, you raised concerns about human rights and women's rights are going to be protected post-Brexit. I just wondered if you expand a little bit more about how leaving the EU could harm human rights.
Women are concerned about the kind of human rights legislation and where it is at the moment, and it's quite strong, and they can use that to support their kind of daily lives, and that they're worried at the moment that leaving the EU, how that human rights legislation is going to be diluted in any way. It's not really been explained kind of what's happening. It's not been kind of brought down to a grassroots level. The talks are still very, very high level. Women have got a lot of employment and kind of social rights under EU legislation, and they're just wanting to know that that those rights are still going to be protected.
So are you saying that replacing the ECHR with the British Bill of Rights is not going to give the same robust protection to women's rights? And are you therefore saying that the Scottish legal system is not adequate to protect those rights?
Well, women have said to us that they don't feel the Bill of Rights is as strong as the...
Is that based on fact, though?
That's based on assumption, on what they've read and kind of what they've found out through the press and through what's been reported. So that's why I'm saying that it's still all very high level. Women are finding out what's coming through the media, which can be skewed at times. So they want to know facts so that they can they can be informed and they can make a decision around that. Their assumptions just now are based on what they hear and what they see through the media.
Mr. Boyle, you want to come in there, yeah?
Yeah, just very briefly. I think what Evelyn's alluding to is that the negotiations in reference to leaving the European Union, additionally alluding to is the final stop before we start to process into the next commitment of the current UK government that they will look to repeal the Human Rights Act. So there's a fear within the third sector generally that we're not splitting up in terms of leaving the European Union and then seeing further regression or a repeal of the Human Rights Act. From our perspective, this is part of a similar process or the same process. So that's why, as the negotiations continue in reference to leaving the European Union, the next stage of that, our fear will be the repeal of the Human Rights Act.
Christy Charlton.
Thank you. My question again, although I had a lot of concerns about what everybody was saying, is specifically to Evelyn Fraser again. You mentioned women and the pension, the change in the pension rights and the pensionable age, which has affected women born in the 1950s specifically. Could you expand a wee bit more on the problems that this has caused and whether you think there is some way of resolving this, or what your organisation would want us to, would want specifically the UK government to be thinking about in terms of resolution?
When the initial changes to the state retirement pension age came in, there was a very short time scale for women born in the early 1950s who'd maybe planned retiring in the early 2010s to actually think about, I've now got to work another 5 years. They had planned their retirement. That was an initial view, that the women thought that they would get their state retirement pension, but they then had to think about the job that we're going to do. Women tend to work in what's classed as low-paid, low-skilled jobs, and a lot of those jobs are maybe cleaning, catering, clerical work, working in shops. And we've had a lot of carers and catering workers coming to us and saying, well, I'm in my 60s now. Maybe 20 years ago, I was fit to do caring work, lifting and handling and moving and all that kind of thing. But physically, I can't do that work anymore. What job am I going to do to see me out to my retirement? So that was a kind of key issue. Another thing that women had spoken about was their kind of ability for long-term planning. They maybe had thought about saving and putting money by, but if they had to change their job or change their career path to fill that gap to retirement age, their salary might drop, and there's still ongoing kind of financial commitments there. Something else that women spoke about as well was that they're what we call sandwich carers in that kind of age group, where they're filling a gap in care around the lack of affordable childcare for their children, and also a lack of elder care where they maybe get elderly relatives or elderly parents. So women are having to work longer, they're trying to support their families, they're juggling financially, they're worried about their pension and what that actually means. They're also worried about when they get to retirement age, are they actually going to have a life after that? Are they going to be so washed out and so kind of brought down that they're not going to be able to actually live and enjoy their retirement? So there's a whole range of issues that women have reported to us, particularly around the pensions issue. I think...
I'm just very conscious of time. We'd leave it there. Are you satisfied, Christine? Yeah. Thank you for that, because I've got a couple of questions from Jed Killen and Danielle Rowley. Jed.
Thank you, Chair. It was, just touching on something we heard in an earlier session about disabled people and work, and broaden that out a bit. The committee heard in the last Parliament about barriers to women, LGBT people, BME community, disabled people, about access to justice when they've been treated unfairly in work. And we saw a huge drop-off with the introduction of tribunal fees, and obviously they've now been found to be unlawful. But is this still an issue for people in these groups, particularly when you're talking about women being treated unfairly, and accessing justice?
Women find it difficult due to a whole range of issues, particularly kind of lack of confidence to actually raise an issue in the first place, and you've got to go through a procedure before you can actually lodge a tribunal claim. So unless a woman is in a trade union and has got that support, she maybe won't take that forward. And because a lot of employers maybe aren't supportive of trade unions, or women don't know how to sign up to a trade union, there's a lot of issues in access to justice at a very basic level, and getting support and actually raising a point in the first place. When it comes to the Employment Tribunal Service, women reported that they didn't actually have the funds available to lodge a tribunal claim in the first place, not even to see that it would go to the next stage. So there has been a drop-off in the number of kind of access to justice cases there, particularly around discrimination and women's rights in the workplace, because they were the higher rate that had to be paid at the Employment Tribunal. So there was a kind of drop-off in the number of claims that were going forward for that. But hopefully, now that the Employment Tribunals have been devolved to Scotland, then we'll see how that goes after that.
Danielle Rowley.
Thank you. You mentioned, Evelyn, in your opening statement about pay gaps. The Equalities and Human Rights Commission recently released a report revealing that pay gaps are still an issue in Scotland, specifically with women, ethnic minorities and people with disabilities. We also, this committee has previously heard that young people are often trapped in low-paid casual work. We've heard a little bit about the reasons behind these pay gaps. So if you've got anything additional to add on the reasons, but also what do you think could be done to address those issues?
Any one of you?
I suppose from a young person's perspective, we've advocated, as I think was mentioned either in this panel or an earlier one today, around the age bands within the national minimum wage or the national living wage, and that the discriminatory functions in there where young people are doing the same work but could be receiving a significant less in their hourly rates, and then obviously their monthly salary.
I would just refer the committee back excuse me, pardon me, to my introductory statement, and what we have in Scotland is a race equality framework for Scotland, and also we've had the release of the race disparity audit from Theresa May. The committee's in an advantageous position to ascertain how those two approaches can complement each other in order to try and progress and amend some of the changes which you've alluded to, or challenges you've alluded to.
I mean, one of the things that we look at with regards to the pay gap is the work that women do, and women tend still to be clustered in low-skilled, low-grade jobs, which only exacerbates the pay gap. And what we'd like to see is employers investing in women and giving them opportunities to apply for training and promotion and putting steps in place. That's kind of an employer's obligation. I think as well, looking at a pay audit and bringing down the number of employees that an employer has to have before they do a pay audit. I mean, they do a financial audit every year, so why not do a pay audit as well? And that can be included, and that would highlight some of the pay differences within companies.
I'm just struck, Susan, with something you said here, and I just found the figure in my papers about what you receive from Erasmus Plus. Did I hear correctly? It's at 200,000?
2 million euros over the last 6 years, in the past 6 years worth of funding.
This will be a huge issue if you lose this money. Is there any provision put in place or any guarantees that you've had that you're going to be able to re-secure this from other sources?
No, I mean, I guess our aim, accepting that Brexit is happening, is to position the UK into a model where the equivalent of, for example, Norway as a European, as a programme country. So non-EU countries can be still be programme countries in Erasmus Plus. I think there are about 5 examples of countries that have that status. But Norway's a good example because it has freedom of movement as part of the success of it. So that would be our ambition, but no, there's certainly no guarantee of that. But certainly the funds that are there are really significant because the Youth Fund particularly prioritises young people who are experiencing the most disadvantage. So there are examples in our written evidence around Jack Cain Centre, an area of significant deprivation in its catchment in Edinburgh, and these young people having their first overseas experiences, and just that sense of social mobility, their value, cultural issues and social justice.
And over the years, many of my constituents have taken advantage of the Erasmus Plus programme, and I'm just struck by the figures here, and obviously concern. Just to you, Ms Fraser, I mean, one of the hottest political issues just now, of course, is state pensions, women's state pensions, and it's, you know, in my view is that at some point there will be like a decision, a vote taken in Parliament, which, you know, will really draw this out. Is there any particular issues when it comes to women's state pensions which are specific to Scotland that you've identified? And, you know, when you were thinking about Scottish Affairs Committee and work that we could do, is there anything that you've detected which is possibly different here in Scotland and the rest of the UK?
I don't think there's anything specific to Scotland. Just, you know, women have raised concerns about the pension age changed quite quickly a few years ago. There is a fear that that could happen again, and there'll be another tranche of women that are in the same position. So we would like to see that kind of monitored to make sure that kind of doesn't happen again, because it was a quick jump the last time from the age of 60 to 65, and it's now going up to the age of 67 before you can claim. But I don't think there's anything particular to Scotland.
Just lastly to you, Mr Boyle, I was interested in your remarks about the race disparity audit, which we secured last week, the statement in the House of Commons. I mean, is there anything, again, particular, you know, with Scotland when it comes to issues round about what was concluded in the race disparity audit, anything that, you know, particularly we could be looking at, you know, like, given that we have a lower number of people from ethnic minorities in Scotland, we have an issue perhaps with a bigger Polish community per head of population than the rest of the UK. Is there anything that strikes you that we could be specifically looking at round about issues to do with race?
Yeah, we'd encourage the committee to ascertain and analyse where we use the positive action measures which are applicable using the Equality Act in order to amend some of these quite clear disparities in employment. It gets slightly more complicated if we're identifying the public sector, for example, as having major underrepresentation from, say, African and South Asian communities, that in many of our local authorities in Scotland we're entering into a period of public sector freeze. So we're not employing large numbers of people. What we've encouraged the Scottish Government to do and others is to look at their procurement process when we're building national infrastructure projects. So, for example, in a Scottish context, that would be relevant to the Scottish Government's commitment to build 50,000 new houses over the course of the next Parliament. What we encouraged them to do was to analyse that from a broad equalities perspective to ensure that we can increase employment in specific areas where we're spending money to do so. And that ties in, with the race framework, which is the Scottish framework, and the race audit complementing each other, and the role that the committee can play in ensuring employment's focused on.
I'm grateful. A last quick question from Mr Master.
Very quickly, just in relation to the race disparity audit, obviously the Scottish Government didn't really take part in that. I think the official quote was they said it wasn't in Scotland's interest to take part. Are you satisfied that we have enough data north of the border to drill down into some of the issues that have been flagged out through the disparity audit?
So the Scottish equivalent we have is the Equality Evidence Finder. Which, yes, it's a living tool, it's a living resource which we have to continue to enhance, but it is in existence in order to respond to the disparities which we've already pre-identified in Scotland. In some circumstances, the UK government and the Scottish government have done this work the other way about. So actually in Scotland we have a race framework which will set the strategy now moving forward, and we're in the process of getting buy-in from other statutory authorities, so on and so forth. The Equality and Human Rights Commission, UK based, have called for the UK government to create a living document which is the same as, well not the same, but relevant to the UK in terms of what the Scottish Government's already developed.
Great. Well, we're going to have to leave it there because colleagues are catching a plane in the next couple of hours. But thank you ever so much for that, and it's been a fascinating session. And you know where we are. If there's anything further that you feel you want to submit to our ongoing inquiry, you have our address. Order, order. That's good. Yeah. Good, wasn't it?